What's up, man? I've got a great interview for you today with Alison Tieman, who is a men's rights activist. And we spent an hour or so talking about the state of things, what men need to be looking out for in 2020 and going forward. And she even had some really useful tips on vetting women. Alison is the founder of Honey Badgers Radio, which is a big podcast where they have some very spirited conversations. So I hope you'll check that out later. I'll link to it down below. And in the meantime, I hope you find this useful. Alison Tieman, thanks for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, let me tell people a little bit about what we're going to talk about today and how we met, because it's kind of an interesting story, at least from my perspective, it's an interesting story. But you are a men's rights activist, and you live in Canada, and I was invited to come speak to the International Conference on Men's Issues last summer. And I have a confession to make that I had bought into what I think is the common perception of men's rights activists. So I halfway expected, because everybody's mad at men's rights activists, right? Even the people who shouldn't be mad at men's rights activists are mad at men's rights activists. So there's this image out there. And I halfway expected that when I showed up, what I would encounter was a bunch of sad men standing around on a rainy street holding sandwich boards and crying while people drove by and threw trash at them, because that's the image that's out there. And what I encountered was actually very different from that. It was a very upbeat conference with people speaking very intelligently about policy initiatives. And it was not a cry fest. It was a solution fest. And you unfortunately weren't able to be there because our border guards decided to give you a hard time about coming across the border and spending all your money in the United States. So that's a different story. But so we've never actually met in person, but here we are today. You gave me a little bit of your time, and I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit about what are some of the main issues that guys out there are facing right now, and strategize a little bit about how to get around some of it. But tell me a little bit about how you came to be a men's rights activist, if you don't mind.
Okay, well, that's a long story. Well, essentially, the short of it is, I went to an all-girls school when I was in my mid-teens, and when I came back, my mother was concerned about how radically feminist I had become. So she gave me a book called The Princess at the Window, which presented to me the opposite side of the story. And from that point in time, I was really fascinated by the issues that men face and that perspective on society, because I'd never heard it before. None of my teachers were talking about it. I actually went to a fairly conservative Christian school for reasons of, well, my father was in the oil industry, and we ended up in an expatriate area in the Middle East, and most of the people in the oil industry tend to be very conservative Christian sort of type of people with conservative values, and we were like the only Democrats in that particular group of people. But because of that, I had a sort of a wider scope of political influence, and my mother had actually, even before this, been a feminist herself. She was one of the people who founded the Take Back the Night March in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And she had ended up being disillusioned with the movement because she had been an editor of a feminist paper or a feminist newsletter. And she would get submissions and she would critique them for grammar and content and coherence. And the people who were on the board of this newsletter with her said that she was actually engaging in a patriarchal critique. Like she was using patriarchy to critique the submissions, even though it was just so that people could understand them and read them and had proper grammar. They accused her of, I guess, internalized misogyny for wanting to pursue like some kind of standard for the paper. And then they drummed her out. They basically socially isolated her and kicked her out. And after that, in a few incidences at Take Back the Night marches where my father had volunteered to make drinks, and there were lesbian separatists who refused to drink anything that he had touched because he was a man, she really questioned the movement and where it was going. I'm not sure if she identified as a feminist while she was like raising me, but that sort of brought her to the point where she was concerned about my radicalism. She had read some of the information about the other side because she had been questioning her beliefs in feminism. And then she gave me that book, and, you know, sort of like off to the races from there. I started to read up all kinds of other books. So Lionel Tiger's book, Lauren Farrell's book, all kinds of other names that I can't give you off the top of my head because I'm terrible with names, but I just dove right into the entire subject, and I just found it fascinating. Partially because people said, no, don't read that. That's not important. And I didn't see it anywhere. So I started reading it when I was mid-teens. And then when I got into college, I got a whole bookshelf. Like in the college library, you know, there's this gigantic section for feminism, and there's a whole bookshelf for men's rights and men's issues. And I read the entire, like, from one book, one end of the bookshelf to the other, all of it. And I was just fascinated by it. And not the least of which because it was like this hidden knowledge that nobody wanted anybody to really know about. And that I thought that was so cool. And I mean, for the most part, I've always been fascinated with like hidden knowledge. I read lots of stuff about the Egyptian mythology, Egyptian Book of the Dead, Greek and Roman mythology, like anything that seemed like it was something mysterious, I would just be instantly drawn to. And men's rights, men's issues was definitely mysterious. Now, when the internet came around, which I was actually on it when I was in my mid-teens and in the mid-90s, but there were these news groups, and one of them was called Sock.men. And there was all kinds of discussion about men's issues coming around, like police brutality was one of those discussions, issues with the criminal sentencing gap, like, so the bias against men in criminal sentencing. So it was just like this this place where there's all this knowledge and these statistics that nobody else was talking about, and all of these researchers, in their little corners of their universities, sort of pursuing this knowledge that nobody else was really funding and nobody else was really getting into. And it was just like this whole mystique was really fascinating to me. So I would read everything on Sock.men about the statistics related to men's issues. At the time, I didn't identify as a men's rights activist. In fact, I was one of those people who said, oh, men's rights activists, they're just like feminists. You know, we should build a rocket and send them all to Mars. The men's rights activists and the feminists. So at that point in time, I didn't identify as a men's rights activist, but I was still fascinated with all of the information and the material. In fact, I think I might have still identified as a feminist, but then there was this one, and it was in the the late 90s, early noughties, is that what they're called? Noughties? Where this situation arose where there was a soldier who got pregnant to get out of going to a war zone. And I remember really distinctly the argument that we had on Sock.men. And I was of the opinion that if she had made an oath to serve her country, she shouldn't do something so selfish, destroy her unit cohesion, destroy the morale of her unit, leave and not do what she had sworn to do. And I said that this just reflected my general anger at the fact that society doesn't hold women to the same standards of responsibility as men. And I remember feminists getting in on that argument and just dismissing the fact that she had betrayed her oath. And just saying, oh, that's blah, blah, blah. And they had no real answer to it. And it was that moment where I said, you know what? I feel betrayed by you. I feel betrayed by feminism, because you talk so much about getting women benefits, privileges, and rights, but you never have the conversation about responsibility, about what women need to do in order to uphold their obligations to society and to men. And at that point, I'm like, you know what? I think we're going to have a parting of the ways with me and feminism. So up to that point, I still thought that there was a place for me in feminism, for my concern about the responsibilities of women. But at that point, I'm like, there's nothing in this movement for me if you don't talk about women's responsibilities. And I still didn't identify as a men's rights activist until I think 2012-ish, when the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, declared the men's rights Reddit, which is sort of like sock.men. Do you know what news groups are?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So
Yeah.
you have a thread, you have a comment, you reply, and then Reddit was like the next sort of form of a news group. And the SPLC had declared men's rights activists, and specifically men's rights Reddit, a hate group. Of course, they later sort of walked it back and said, nah, we didn't really completely do that. But when that happened, there were people or men on men's rights Reddit who said, this had been their sole source of support for the issues that they faced. And they said they were starting to talk about, it's not worth it continuing when the world has such a level of hatred towards us and our issues. And so there were some of them who were talking about suicide, and a couple of them we never heard from again. Like, that was it. They were gone. And that really impacted me. And I felt like I got to do something to reach out to these guys and try to stop this, because this isn't fair. We're in a situation where these guys, this is their only support system. And the SPLC is saying it's this depraved, horrible thing. And it isn't. It's not hatred of women. Expecting women to take responsibility is not hatred of women. Judging women morally is not hatred of women. And this is their only source of support for it. And some of them have, they've been raped by women. They've endured domestic violence from women, all kinds of horrible things. And this is their support. And I felt like I had to do something. So at that moment, I got on YouTube and I said, okay, if the SPLC is going to call men's rights Reddit a hate group, and then I'm going with you. I am a men's rights activist now, and you can call me part of a hate group too. And it was my small way of trying to shield them, or at least try to take responsibility for what the SPLC was doing and do something to say, no, this is too much. This is going too far. If you want to do that to these people, then you can do it to me too. And so that's when I actually started to identify as a men's rights activist. And I'm going to identify as a men's rights activist until people stop seeing it as weird or wrong, even it's beyond weird, as wrong to advocate for men's rights. Like, it's not wrong.
You mentioned a couple of times rights without responsibility, and this is something that troubles you. This is something that's very dangerous. And if you follow conversations in the manosphere, if we can still call it the manosphere, you see that theme quite a bit, that rights without responsibilities are one of the things that really set guys up to get in trouble with women, false domestic violence accusations and so forth. And then there's such a protective force around that dynamic of rights without responsibilities in some quarters. Like if you go on Twitter and you see people like John Barry out of the UK, there are several researchers out of the UK talking about the fact that women are just as more likely in some ways to initiate violence in the home. So men and women do violence a little bit differently. And so it shows up a little bit differently in the home, but women are just as violent, more often violent in some ways. And you'll see this attempt to shut down this conversation, that no, women can't be responsible for that type of thing. I mean, that's the message that lies behind trying to shut it down, is that women cannot be held responsible when they become violent. Because, and I've had somebody actually tell me this in a clinical setting, that if a woman gets violent, it's only because she's defending herself. And so there's that kind of protection of this it's a protection of the protection of women, that women cannot be held accountable. And it's insulting to both genders. It's insulting to women to say that you can't be held accountable for your decisions and your choices. But it's also particularly dangerous for men, because this has shown up, like so many things show up first on college campuses, where men are the target of kangaroo courts and so forth. All a person, up until recently, all a woman had to do on campus was make an anonymous accusation against a man, and he potentially had his future destroyed. So recently here in the US, there have been some reforms to Title IX, which is that whole story behind that. But it led to these kangaroo courts. Didn't start that way, but it led to the 10 kangaroo courts, starting with Joe Biden's Dear Colleague letter, Obama's Dear Colleague letter back in 2011, I think it was. But anyway, so we've had some reforms, and I'm suspicious of the reforms. So, what are your thoughts on the Title IX reform, and what do guys need to be looking out for?
Well, I would say that the Title IX reforms pursued by Betsy DeVos are not enough. I would honestly say that sexual assault cases belong in the criminal justice system.
You would think that a criminal act would end up in criminal court, but yes.
Yeah, like things, the original purpose of these campus sort of tribunals was things like cheating and other kind of academic misconduct. But now they've assumed this role as arbiters over students' sex lives, which, you know, I don't even think that necessarily is appropriate for, if there's an issue of rape, if there's issue of sexual assault or harassment. Well, perhaps harassment in the context of work environment, but if it's a crime on the level of sexual assault, probably should go to the criminal justice system. Unless we defund it all, but that might not exist in the future. But it really, in my opinion, it belongs with people who are trained in evaluating and gathering evidence of crime. But so the reforms really should just be taking this off the campus entirely and just deferring it to the police. But insofar as I can discuss the reforms themselves, I believe they bring back a little bit more due process. I'm looking at some information. They they do things like now people who are men who are accused of sexual assault on campuses can get notice of being accused. And they uphold the right to the advisor and the right to submit, cross-examine, and challenge evidence at a live hearing. So the reforms are giving the accused some basic rights that they didn't have before. Kangaroo courts really applied to these tribunals in the past. But again, there's things like the accuser no longer has to be subjected to cross-examination. So the accused can't actually question the accuser on her testimony. And that's, I don't think the reform actually changes that, which suggests that it really isn't sufficient. And it also apparently requires schools to select one of two standards of evidence: the preponderance of the evidence standard or the clear or convincing evidence standard, and to apply the selected standard evenly to proceedings for all students and employees. So here's another thing. The reforms are just requiring schools to select which standard that they're going to use, not beyond, we're well beyond a shadow of a doubt, which is the criminal standard. So we're at preponderance of the evidence or clear and convincing. So we've gone from a young man can be convicted of sexual assault with 50% evidence plus 0.1. And you have to think about the context of this. So he's making a testimony, I didn't do it. She's making a testimony, he did it. And all of the people involved in the tribunal are been trained by feminist individuals to say that, you know, women never lie, and it's so rare that women lie about sexual assault that it's not even, it can't, don't even let it come into your thinking.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at a situation where they've set up to undercut and undermine his testimony and make her testimony bulletproof. So when we're looking at just a preponderance of the evidence standard in these college tribunals, we're looking at situations where all she has to do is say he did it, and that's it. That's preponderance of the evidence.
Right.
In many cases.
And I will say, in the colleges, in the college's defense, of the colleges who adopted this, I think anyone who's tied to federal funding had to adopt Title IX. And I will say in their defense that the Dear Colleague letter set it up so that they were compelled to create these tribunals and these kangaroo courts, but they certainly didn't protest. They were, when the Dear Colleague letter was written, it was being written to institutions that had these gender studies departments in which you had ideologues who were just champing at the bit to correct what they see as historical injustice going back centuries against women, and here's a chance to get their pound of flesh. So they certainly adopted the Dear Colleague letter with a great deal of enthusiasm. And my concern is that those same ideologues are still on campus, and now they're backed into a corner. And this is what frightens me for young men on campus, because I'm paranoid. Part of my job as a clinical psychologist is to be a little bit paranoid. And so thinking on these guys' behalfs, they're still dealing with these ideologues. And I don't know what the next move of the ideologues is. I know that they're funded. I know that they're organized. And I know that they have their journals and they all communicate to each other. And the campus is not a safe place now for young men, just
it hasn't
because
been for a while.
These Title IX reforms don't change that for guys, in my estimation. Maybe they get a little more due process, but I don't trust that there's not another volley that's being formed.
Oh, there is more to all of this. You're right to be suspicious of the college administrations, because when Betsy DeVos began her investigation into doing the reforms, and I believe that they sent, like the Trump administration sent an updated policy, and the college administrations essentially said, yeah, we're not going to follow this. We're just, and so they had to give this more teeth. So this is what we're seeing, is that they're coming back and they're saying, no, you actually have to do this. You don't have a choice. Because the colleges were just pursuing their kangaroo courts the way they had in the past. Right. And so what I wanted to say about the preponderance of the evidence is, now they're saying they have to use a preponderance of the evidence or a clear and convincing standard. And a clear and convincing is, I think, like 75%. If you're looking at it in terms of what the evidence suggests. So preponderance of the evidence is what is necessary in a criminal court, in a civil court to award damages. So it's just the most likely thing. It's most likely that this thing occurred. Clear and convincing, I'm not sure which court uses it, but it's sort of like, I'm pretty sure it's like 75% evidence suggests that it occurred. And then you have beyond a shadow of a doubt, which is what criminal courts use, which is like 99% of the evidence. And they're not even going to the criminal court standard for these sexual misconduct cases. Even though the level of damage that an accusation of sexual misconduct does to a student's life and potential prospects, a male student's life and potential prospects, is unbelievable. Like nobody's going to touch him after that.
Right.
So they're effectively murdering his career and potentially his social life and his ability to go out, get a partner, get a job, get a partner, have a family. And we're doing that based on, well, it's the college's discretion if they want to do that based on simply the woman's testimony with a preponderance of the evidence, or they want to do it with clear and convincing. So maybe her testimony and her friend's testimony, and then his life is ruined.
Right.
that kind of thing. So yeah, it's still a scary time, a scary place for young men on college campuses.
Yeah. And so that's why my advice for young guys on campus is, if you have to be there, first of all, don't be there if you don't need to be there. But if you want to be an accountant or a nurse or a doctor or something like that, you need to go to campus. Treat it like you would treat your employer, that everybody there is off limits. You're there to do your job. You don't date anybody on campus.
Yeah,
You don't flirt with anybody on campus. There's nothing on campus that you can't get somewhere else. So just leave it alone, do your job, keep your head down, and keep everything public. And just, don't date on campus. It's a pretty simple intervention.
And don't I would add to that, like, don't be alone with a woman on campus. Like, don't if don't go like have lunch with a woman outside of the eye shot and earshot of people. I mean, if you really want to be safe, also be recording things so that you have evidence that you've done nothing wrong. And the problem is that sometimes young men, or men in general, will run afoul of a woman who's particularly vicious, and there's nothing they can do because she can just accuse them. And what do you do? So it definitely just keep your head down. Don't flirt. Don't talk to women more than necessary, in my opinion. I know this sounds really paranoid.
It's sad that we're saying this, but this it's the state of affairs right now.
It's the state of affairs, and don't go anywhere near the women's studies departments.
No.
Or any woman who has any kind of who takes lessons there, or it's not worth it. It's just avoid it, unless she's in a situation where she was forced to, for her engineering degree, pick up a social studies course or something, and she figured women's studies would be easy. But so that's probably okay. But in general, try to avoid the women's studies majors or the gender studies majors, and for your own safety, just leave them alone. Don't get involved with them. Don't even get and don't talk about this stuff on the internet if you're in that kind of a situation too, or at least not in a way that can be traced back to you. Don't make enemies by going on Twitter and tweeting your women's studies department. You guys are a bunch of fat bitches. No, it's not going to end well for you.
Yeah. So I get a little bit of heat because I very publicly say, don't date feminists. And it's not that I think feminists are bad people. I think they've been infected typically by an ideology. And I separate, there are people who call themselves feminists who think that feminism is about equality. They're mistaken. That's what they think. That's fine. No big deal. But people who've been bitten by the bug, people who have the ideology, they need to have an oppressor. And because that's part of their ideology. And without that, they lose their identity if they don't have an oppressor. And so if you're the closest man to them and they need a male oppressor, well, guess what's going to happen to you? So I say very publicly, I'll say it 1,000 times, do not date feminist ideologues. But let's step off the campus for a minute. And you've been looking at the issues that men face for a very long time. And I'm always interested in helping men have good relationships and strategize about who they allow into their lives. So, Alison, what do you think going forward in 2020? What are the big issues that men really need to be looking out for just in life or in romance, so they can stay away from family court, they can stay away from false accusations, they can stay away from all these things?
Ooh, like the problem is that I talk about these things, and I could give advice, but I don't know if I can do something like, oh, you absolutely do this, and this woman won't go sideways on you.
Well, there's always randomness in the environment, right? Like you can meet somebody, and people do change. They don't change very often, but people change. And
I would think that if a woman has curiosity about men, and their issues, and recognizes that they have their own perspective and their own vulnerabilities, and is able to actually be interested in it instead of repulsed by it, that might be a good sign. Because the thing is that when women are curious about, the way men think and the way men operate and the issues that men have, it's an acknowledgement that there's a legitimacy to being a man. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's a legitimateness to that perspective, and they have a curiosity about it because they recognize it as different but not wrong. And I would say that might be a trait to look for. And a curiosity doesn't mean like, so if you have a woman who's curious about your interests, curious about who you are, curious about how you think, that doesn't necessarily mean that she becomes like, because there's a type of woman who they find a man and their man sort of becomes that, like they sort of like wrap themselves and they just do everything he does. His friends become her friends, his interests become her interests. Like she doesn't have her own thing going on. Mm-hmm. Being curious doesn't mean that that woman who is curious is going to just absorb all of the things you do and just take over everything that you do. But they'll have a curiosity in that. And I think that's something that I think helps with long-term relationships, is to maintain that curiosity with what your partner is up to, what he's interested in, and and his thought processes. At least for me, that's my own experience, is that I married a man who I didn't always quite get where he was coming from, so I had to extend my thinking to just try to understand his perspective. And it's not in a bad way, but he's his own, like, he has his own way of doing things and way of thinking. And to me, it's been interesting to try to understand how he thinks, how he works. And I think that maybe that might be a trait. I don't know if anybody else points out this is a possible trait to look for but that curiosity, that willingness to explore and to be wrong too is something. Like I saw, Cassie J with the red pill. Mm-hmm. I think that was the trait that she really had, was curiosity. Mm-hmm. And her curiosity led her to really just keep coming back to the issues that the men's rights activists were presenting to her. And she's like, oh, I got to understand where they're coming from. And that itself, I think, eventually led her to say, you know what, I'm not going to identify as a feminist anymore because I see where they're coming from now. It was the curiosity. Right. And I think that's a good trait to look for.
Yeah, inquisitiveness, and you also, the two things you talked about there were inquisitiveness and tolerance for different points of view, which, one would look at Twitter and think that that's not how we do things anymore in 2020. But I don't know. It seems like most people out there are pretty rational, hopefully. But I think that's hopefully, a good, yeah, I think that's a good litmus test to give guys. Like, does she have that intellectual curiosity about what you're doing with life and what's going on for you? And what is the world like for you? So imagine in all the years that you've been doing this, you probably come across some pretty awful horror stories about men ending up in family court and, men having false accusations and that sort of thing. And have you noticed any trends that would be useful?
Don't date victims.
Yeah, good advice. So how do you identify a victim?
If she, the first date, she starts talking about how her ex did her wrong, that's probably a good sign.
Yeah.
People who give up a lot of personal information about their victimhood, like really in the beginning, when you're starting to date, when it's not really appropriate.
Like that's their identity.
Yeah. Well, or they don't understand there's a bit of a boundary there. When you start out, you don't talk about how all the horrible things that have happened to you. You don't interface with other people using your victimhood. See what I'm saying? There are people who do that. They just start off and they just express or women in particular express all of the horrible things that their exes did to them, or the horrible things that have happened to them. And it's like It's almost like a forced intimacy, because this is something that, you know, usually people tell each other after they really know each other well, as they expose their vulnerability, because it is a vulnerability, and that you don't do that with a complete stranger unless you're using your vulnerability to manipulate them, or to force bonding faster than it should go, which is manipulation. So when people do that, when in particular women do that, when they talk about their vulnerability right up front before it's really appropriate, before they've established that you're safe to do it too, or even that you're somebody who can even handle this kind of thing. Because in some cases you don't talk about stuff because, you know, the person isn't really, the relationship isn't at a place where it's really appropriate. You know what I mean? To lay something like that on them. When women do that, that's manipulation. They are saying that our primary, you as a man and me as a woman, our primary relationship, I'm going to establish it now. I'm a victim, you save me, until I decide that you are the one who is the villain. And then I'm going to find another man and I'm going to say, I'm a victim, you save me. And that they're already establishing right at the beginning the relationship. So if a woman starts talking about her victimhood, women's victimhood period, that's manipulation. And also it's a false affectation of vulnerability. And it's manipulative, because nobody does that if they're genuinely vulnerable. Anybody who's genuinely vulnerable will wait until they've established an intimacy with you via, I don't know, doing things together or shared activities or whatever. They'll wait till they establish the intimacy, that so they know that you're somebody who they can trust their vulnerabilities with. If they're front loading their vulnerabilities, it's because they aren't really vulnerabilities. They are power moves to establish dominance through vulnerability.
Yeah, and I think one way a guy can pick up on that is just to check his own gut reaction to that, because a lot of times when these things are unfolding in front of you, you're a little disoriented, because that's the nature of this sort of interaction, is to disorient to some degree. And so you're disoriented, you're not really clear on what's going on. But if you get that little spidey sense tingling, that little gut feeling that says something's really not feeling quite right about this, then you stop and you check it out. And that's I think that's there's really good insight to, you know, people putting their victimhood up front. Let me ask you a really tough question. Where do you think feminists have a point? And the reason I'm asking this is because so much of the problems between men and women right now, as if we don't have enough difficulty communicating to start with and getting along. I mean, we communicate very well and get along well in some ways, and other ways are pretty challenged. But so much of the current tension between men and women seems to me to come down to feminist ideology. And so it makes me wonder, is there something going on that I'm missing? Do they have a point about something?
There needs to be some introspection about how men and women relate. And while I think feminists get a very distorted picture, I think that the fact that they're actually pursuing introspection about it, even if it is distorted, at least is a step in the right direction. I think where they get wrong, like the problem with feminist analysis is I think they're very right when they talk a lot about the expression of how things affect women. I mean, that's fairly genuine. Where they go wrong is attributing malice on the part of men, and also not looking at the situation for men and how men feel about what's going on with them. They don't look at that. They don't consider it. And it actually is interesting, because even though I say that feminists take that first step to investigate the situation between men and women and say, this is something that we need to look at. Let's not just accept what our ancestors did or our parents did. Let's look at this and see if it's really working for us. I don't think that they necessarily say it in such charitable terms. I think it's more smash the patriarchy, male privilege, toxic masculinity, but at least that first step seems to be legitimate to me. But what I'm noticing is that feminists, while they take that first step, they almost immediately step 10 steps backwards, because they are, in expressing how things affect women, they're basically just doing womening more. That's sort of like, just, they're womening more. They're not really inspecting what being feminine is, what being masculine is. They're just doing more of the same thing. And they're expecting men to do more of the same thing, which is to look at the concerns that they raise and save them from them. So it's like they're like, well, we'll smash the gender roles by doing them even faster and harder than anyone has ever done before. You know, like doing them even more.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, I don't think you are doing that. I think you're doing the opposite.
It's the opposite. Yeah, it seems to me that feminists almost hate femininity as much as they hate masculinity.
Well, I don't know if they hate femininity, because they're always like saying men need to do things the way women do.
Yes, my profession in particular, we're very female-centric.
Yeah, so they're always saying that men need to express themselves the way women do. Of course, they don't. I mean, they say men should cry, but of course, then the other side of their mouth they're saying, but they have nothing to cry about. You know, so it's like, it's this interesting sort of situation. I don't think they're necessarily against femininity. I think they're against any kind of femininity that is are attracted to or wants to be with masculinity. I think they have a problem with that. But this idea that there's this femininity that's better than masculinity, I think they have a strong sense of that. And I think when you look at them trying to appropriate masculine things, it's more about being a victim of not having them necessarily than really understanding where people who are masculine come from in their thinking and trying to integrate that into themselves. So I don't see that at all. I don't see any respect for masculinity and the way that masculinity operates or the expression of masculinity. It seems like everything is about presenting that point of view as wrong or illegitimate. And the easiest way to explain this is, a couple of years ago, when I first started hearing toxic masculinity all over the place, I started asking feminists, okay, so are there any positive traits that men and masculine individuals have that women and feminine individuals don't have, in the same way that you say that men and masculine individuals have toxic traits? I have yet to receive an answer from any feminist. So all masculine traits in feminist thinking are toxic because they don't identify any positive ones or even neutral ones. They're just all toxic.
So my profession is of psychology is pretty guilty of this lately. We had the APA, the American Psychological Association, last year came out with their guidelines for working with boys and men. And what they seemed to do and I looked at them very closely, is they took masculinity in a very vague, generic sense, and they lumped it in with alcoholism and abuse and all of these maladaptive coping strategies. And they said, well, we're going to lump these all together and we're just going to call it toxic masculinity. And if you read those guidelines, you don't see any real understanding of how men function and no desire to understand it. It's really just a desire to label it and to shut it down.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's exactly what it is. It's just, they don't want men identifying as men. It is the conclusion that I've come to. They just don't want the identity to exist.
Right. So women then are kind of caught in a conundrum here because, well, maybe not, but women, at least most heterosexual women, tend to like men who have masculine traits. It's shocking, that someone should write a paper on that. But what are you supposed to make of this? If you're a young woman and you're going to school, or you're not even going to school, you're just reading what's on the internet, and you're hearing that the thing that you're attracted to is toxic, that's got to be kind of a strange message.
Well, yeah, it's a war on women's desire, really, for men. They're trying to take away what women desire. I mean, I've been thinking about this. If we could actually construct a world in which a majority of men were as attractive, 50 Shades of Grey, Anastasia Steele and Dorian Gray. I use this because it's sort of a hilarious example, but if every man was Dorian Gray, was it Dorian Gray? Well, anyway, Christian Grey. Dorian Gray is like that's actually literature, but Christian Grey. If every man was Christian Grey, I think women would be a lot happier, or as attractive as Christian Grey to them. I think women would be a lot happier. And that doesn't have to happen by making every man Christian Grey. It can happen by simply creating a way for men to be masculine and develop their masculinity to actually accept the idea that men have something that women do not, just by being men.
Yeah.
You know, that can create that sense of attraction, you know, and then every man can actually take part in that. And every woman can have a man that she's attracted to. And I think they'd be a lot happier than that, in that scenario, than this scenario where they're only attracted to the top 20%. And they feed themselves with expensive shoes and clothing and food that's making them fat. Like it's just this consumer lifestyle, which I think is coming in the place of a genuine desire for women, for men. And part of the reason why is we have all of these narratives that make men ashamed of their masculinity. So they hide something that in a more healthier society, they would be able to show and generate a sense of desire in women. You see what I'm saying? So we make men hide their masculinity, but it's masculinity that women are attracted to. And then as an end result, there's only 20% of men who are attracted. And those are the men who just don't listen to all the messages.
That's it exactly. Yeah. And I think that my stance on this, and going back to the Dorian Gray thing, I think it was a picture of Dorian Gray was the book, right? Where the guy essentially made a deal with the devil to hold on to his youth and good looks until he.
Yeah, I mixed up those into my mind. 50 Shades of Grey is Christian Grey.
Okay.
And Anastasia Steele.
I'll have to take your word for it on that one, because I've not read it, but apparently it's high literature.
I know it's not. Terrible.
But it's very appealing though, right? And and I know enough about the book to know what it is that I think is appealing to women.
I have read parts of the book, and I still don't know what's appealing about it.
Okay.
I think.
What do you think? What do you think is appealing?
Okay, if I had to make a guess, Anastasia Steele is the most bland, nothing person I've ever read. Like she just has no features. She has no traits. She has nothing that really makes her, that you can actually feel as a reader, that makes any of the amount of men who are attracted to her. It doesn't make any sense. So I think she's just basically this sort of vague self-insert. Like, so anybody who reads it can insert themselves into her.
Okay.
And it creates this situation where this individual who has absolutely no merit, like this woman has no merit whatsoever. I think she might be a journalist or something. No, or an English major. She's an English major. And she has, in the beginning of the book, I haven't read past like chapter 5 because it's bad. It's terrible. But she has 3 men who are all lusting after her. And I'm like, after what? She's completely bland. And then she also has her friend who's just unconscionably, like constantly complimenting her and all of this stuff. And it's like, but she doesn't have a personality. She doesn't have she doesn't even seem to have any values or anything. She's got nothing. And then she has these 3 men after her. I think it's basically just a power fantasy. And every single one of these men is creepy. I'm not kidding. They're creepy, boundary breaking, rapey, and very, very attractive, but very, very attractive to her, except one who's almost identical to the other 2 is a billionaire. And she spends the first 5 chapters confused why she's attracted to him, but not the other 2.
Okay, and that's the Christian Grey character. He's the billionaire.
That's the Christian Grey character. And
is there anything attractive about this guy? What is it about this character?
I can't even, like, I'm not the woman to ask, because I read that, I'm like, is there something that's supposed to be attractive about this man? Because he just seems creepy and not even just creepy, just there doesn't seem to be anything of worth except the fact that he's a millionaire and the stockbroker and whatever else. And it's like if I had to guess what makes him attractive, he's controlling, I guess, so a certain type of woman would like that. He's mysterious and well, supposedly mysterious. He doesn't seem really that mysterious to me, but you know, and it's this he's like a bad boy or something, which, you know, and then I think the real issue is that she has absolutely nothing to offer, and yet she's getting a top 20% man.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what's really happening here, is that this is a fantasy for all of those women who don't actually, like, Christian Grey in real life might have sex with them, but would never have a relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a story about, oh, I actually got to bag the 20%, like a guy in one of the 20%. Oh, well, Christian Grey is probably the top 0.01%, but you know, I got to bag one of those guys, even though I'm a basic nothing burger, you know?
So all these men lusting after a bowl of warm ramen, I guess.
Yeah. The warm ramen might actually have more personality, maybe like porridge or.
Well, you touched on something earlier and I brushed past it. You said it's the guys who don't care that are most attractive. I think you said something like that, right?
Maybe. I don't think I said that explicitly. I think it's more like it's not that he doesn't care, it's that he has something of his own that he cares about.
Right.
You know, it's because it's not like, I don't think women ultimately want men who don't care. They just want men who have their own logic. You know, they got their own thing going on, and they have their own way of thinking, and they don't just turn into us, you know, their only existence is to save you from stuff. You see what I'm saying? It's like they have their own thing that they're doing and they're pursuing.
Yeah, well, that's going to bring a sense of security to a woman, and you know, anybody who enters a relationship wants some kind of sense of security, and women want a sense of security. And you're more secure with a guy who knows what he's doing and isn't existing for you than you are with somebody who's just existing for you. That's a very shaky foundation. And one of my beliefs about men becoming masculine is that we need to stop asking women what's okay in terms of masculinity. We need to essentially not care what women's opinion of masculinity is, especially in an environment where you can't win. You ask the APA what's okay in terms of masculinity.
Nothing.
Well, you need to cry, but then shame on you if you cry. There's all these double binds around it. And the only way to win that game if you're a man is just not to play it and have your own life and have your own concerns. And then you can have close relationships, but you can't do it in the other order. You can't have the close relationships first and then try to discover who you are as a man.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I think that's really where the not caring comes from. It's not caring.
Sure. It's not caring about other human beings. It's not caring about so much about people's opinion of your masculinity.
Or having other things to care about so that you feel like, you know, I mean, even that's a really high standard, to not care about other people's opinions, to hold men to. Like, you want to move towards, you know, self-confidence, but I don't think there's any human being on the earth who really can get to a point where they can't care about other people's opinions.
Well, I've worked in prisons. I met some people who didn't care about other people's opinions, so they end up in prison because that's what a sociopath does. So yeah, you do need to have some grounding in other people's opinions. But I think maybe what we're talking about here is seeking approval on your masculinity rather than having your own mission and following your own mission. And anybody who wants to join in can join in, and anybody who doesn't need to. They can go back to their gender studies course and complain about how they've been victimized.
I think that's what women find attractive, is that it's not that don't care, it's that they care about something other, and they have their own purpose or movement towards something. And that, I think that brings back to the curiosity, because when you do that, then you can find, or you can engage curiosity. You can gauge a woman who might want to have something that they don't immediately understand, and just actually, and that's the thing, like, what I was getting at is, you have women who don't like that they don't understand something, so they need to control it and make it bend to them, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have women who are okay with that because they can tolerate not knowing.
Yeah, and that controlling, that the desire to bend reality is really a fear-based response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Alison, God, this has gone by really quickly. I hope we can do it again at some point. But let me ask you one last question. I'll put you on the spot here. There's some 20-year-old guy out there might be watching this. What do you have any blanket advice for him on how to navigate just the world or relationships or any of the issues that you've been looking at for the last few decades? Well, you're not that old, but you know what I mean, last several years.
No, it's decades. I am pretty old. What the advice I would give would be, figure out what drives you. Spend some time just figuring out what drives you, what you're using right now to reward yourself to move forward, and figure out a way to get as much control over how you reward yourself day to day as possible. And that might be working on like any kind of like alcohol or drug addiction, or addiction to women's approval.
Mm-hmm.
And see if you can develop a method of getting as much control over that as possible, personal control over the things that you are actually rewarding it, and take it out of the subconscious and make it conscious. So that, and as you develop control over what you're using to reward yourself, and we all do that, like, there are things that we do, rituals that we pursue that make us get through the day, essentially. And if you start to establish control over that, and control is being able to give it to yourself, being able to figure out ways of rewarding yourself that are cheap, that don't involve drugs, that don't involve sex, that don't involve things that will harm you, and you work on that. And I think that you'll be able to navigate the world better. Because I think that a lot of the ways that we get off the paths that we choose is because we're pursuing a reward that we haven't looked at consciously. It's an unconscious reward that we're pursuing, and haven't looked at it consciously. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me. It's brilliant advice.
Yeah. So look at what rewards you and what rewards you're pursuing in your life, and ask yourself, do these work for me?
Yes.
And if not, then bring them under your control and find something new.
Right on. Excellent advice. Well, thanks, Alison. Really appreciate your time, and hopefully we can do this again before too long.
Yeah. It would be great to come back and talk about some more stuff.
All right.
Health related.
All right. Well, thanks for your time.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on again.
You bet.